Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. And I'm also very happy to speak as a part of the panel named The Foundations, because even though I will be talking about something totally different than Deborah and Joachim, I think that in the end, this paper really is about an important part of the material foundations of German Jewish scholarship. And here I mean specifically, it's no surprise, the communal and institutional libraries that were developed for the most part over the course of 19th and 20th centuries by some prominent German Jewish communities and institutions, to name a few Jewish communities in Berlin, Munich, Frankfurt, of course, Hamburg, Breslau, Königsberg, as well as the rabbinical seminaries in Breslau and Berlin. And these are really only a few of many prominent collections. Each of these libraries was of great value and historical significance, not least as a testimony of the great variety of cultural and spiritual traditions of German Jews. And for many years, these libraries served as an intellectual home for several generations of German Jewish leaders and the intellectuals, especially those connected to the Wissenschaft des Judentums. However, despite their great importance for the Jewish, I would say, cultural, intellectual life in Germany, but also that of Central and Eastern Europe in general, little is known about the history during and especially after World War II. And this is precisely the gap that I want to address with this upcoming book of mine, A History of Disappearance. Where are the looted German Jewish libraries? So what happened to them in the wake of the Holocaust? And when one asks this question, the available historical research usually offers one not entirely incorrect answer by pointing to the fact that they were plundered by the Nazis and possibly destroyed by the Nazis. And indeed, most of the communal and institutional libraries of German Jews were looted by the SD in the first half of 1939, especially summer months, and then transferred to this building to Reich Main Security Office in Berlin, where they were supposed to be utilized for the development of the regime's anti-Jewish ideology. And here you can see a list of 71 major German Jewish libraries reported to the SD in May 1939. So this transfer involved, of course, a lot of destruction, but still large parts of the libraries were kept in Berlin until 1943, when, following Allied bombings of Germany, Nazi authorities decided to evacuate the most important libraries to a number of safe locations within the German province, including the Theresienstadt ghetto camp and several castles in the Sudetenland, most importantly 4 castles, the castle of Nimes, the castle of Hauska, Nowy Falkenburg, and Nowy Bernstein. And here you can see the castle of Nimes and the looted books in the attic of Nowy Bernstein as well. So this evacuation was a critical point in the history of the libraries. Following the relocation to the Bohemian lands, a territory that became a part of Czechoslovakia after the war, their fate became intertwined with that of Czechoslovak Jews and the Czechoslovak state. It played out outside the geographical borders of post-war Germany, and thus it was often overlooked by the researchers who dealt with the German Jewish history per se within Germany after 1945. And this is perhaps the reason, I think, why the libraries are still widely believed to have been just entirely destroyed or lost during the war, but this was not the case. And in the following, I will try to briefly outline what happened to them in Czechoslovakia. So among the first people who took interest in the fate of the looted libraries in Czechoslovakia were these two employees of the Jewish Museum in Prague, its first director, Hanna Volavkova, and its chief librarian, Otto Muneles, both with really incredibly fascinating biographies, which I could not, unfortunately, discuss now, maybe beyond the fact that both had been imprisoned in Theresienstadt during the war, and Muneles even, he had been forced to catalog the looted books the Nazis brought there from Berlin in 1943. So immediately after liberation, Volavkova petitioned Czechoslovak authorities for permission to transfer the looted Jewish libraries from the ghetto to Prague. She clearly understood that amid the chaos that really followed the arrival of the Red Army in Terezin, the collection still faced constant danger of another plunder, of course, by soldiers, but also former inmates, local population, but also of destruction due to poor storage conditions there. And Volavkova managed to obtain this permission already in early August 1945. It took her 2 months to bring the libraries to Prague, and this despite great difficulties posed by the Soviet soldiers, and I am quoting from her report on the situation in Terezin. Before we had completed the removal of the libraries, the Russians arrived and ordered the entire area to be cleared. At that time, the situation in Terezin was so tense that a Russian officer threatened to shoot me because I also wanted to take shelves for our libraries. We tried to speed up the waiting of books as much as we could, as the number of Russians kept growing, and with it also the difficulties and the prohibitions." End of quote. Thanks to the immense efforts that Volavkova invested in the transfer, the looted libraries returned to Jewish hands relatively early, within a few months of liberation. However, Czechoslovak authorities did not recognize the Jewish Museum as the lawful owner of the collection, but only as a temporary custodian. At the end of the war, the legal status of the looted libraries became extremely complex, largely due to the anti-German legislation enacted by the Czechoslovak state at the same time. And this legislation was a main factor that shaped the fate of the libraries from now on. In the immediate post-war months, as part of the kind of reconstruction efforts, Czechoslovakia enacted a series of laws that invalidated all the property transfers, such as, for instance, acts of Aryanization, which were carried out during the Nazi occupation. But at the same time, the government granted itself the right to safeguard and later to nationalize all the assets of the so-called state enemies, a category that included not only Nazis and their collaborators, but also Germans and Hungarians, who were collectively accused of supporting the occupation. The confiscation of their property was part of a broader program that aimed at the expulsion of these two largest Czechoslovakia minorities from the state, which was then officially ratified at the Potsdam Conference. While these regulations did not seemingly apply to Jewish property, they nevertheless had severe consequences for the community of Czechoslovak Jews, as the authorities failed to specify the conditions for the restitution of looted Jewish assets, and this includes our libraries, which were thus lumped together with the enemy property and placed under the control of the state. And in order to get back their property, Jewish survivors were forced to file restitution claims, a process that often requires proving a kind of lack of any connections to the occupier's language or culture, which, as you can imagine, disqualified many survivors simply because German was their mother tongue. And this particular blindness, I would say, of the Czechoslovak authorities to the difference between German and German Jewish property had a decisive influence on the fate of the looted libraries, which were now transferred to the several state bodies, each with a different concept of the role that the books should play in the post-war state. So the libraries from Theresienstadt were entrusted to the so-called Central Terezin Commission. Acting under the auspices of the Ministry of Labor, the Commission was in charge of all the property in the former ghetto camp, including the bank accounts of the prisoners. And despite the protest of the Jewish community in Prague, the Commission sought to use this property for the rehabilitation of all the victims of the war, which meant Jews and non-Jews alike, and was therefore quite skeptical and often, openly hostile to any external claim to the property from the ghetto. Although the Commission was primarily interested in liquid assets, let's put it this way, it didn't agree to exclude cultural objects from its authority and preferred to hold on to them even though it didn't have a clear plan for their future use. Then, the looted books that were transferred from Berlin to Sudetenland, and I hope you still remember this second major location, they found themselves under jurisdiction of no less than 4 different bodies that you can see. So the first was the National Library in Prague, which led the confiscation of German libraries, all the German libraries in Czechoslovakia, with the aim to kind of utilize them to restore its own collections, which were heavily damaged during the war. And in 1945-46, in parallel, ironically a little bit, to the deportation of 3 million of Germans from Czechoslovakia, hundreds of thousands of German books, and this includes German Jewish libraries, were incorporated into the holdings of the National Library in Prague. Then, the second body was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the ministry advocated for using primarily the foreign property discovered in the state in the negotiations on the return of Czech property displaced during the war to other countries, especially, of course, Germany, and viewed the books primarily as diplomatic assets. And here, is the stance of the ministry as put in the recommendation of one of its representatives, Jan Opoczynski. And I quote, "For Czechoslovak history, this material has no significant value, but for the German authorities, it is very valuable. Therefore, it will be quite useful for us in the negotiations with Germany on the restitution of cultural material. We may claim that it has been forfeited in favor of the Czechoslovak Republic, according to the provisions of the Decree on Confiscation of German Property, and we may be able to demand the return of cultural material kept in Germany that we could not request otherwise." And only in 1946, Czechoslovakia returned some of the looted libraries discovered in Sudetenland to France, Belgium, Netherlands, Italy, Hungary, Switzerland, and Poland. And interestingly, the restitution to Poland included some of the collections of the Rabbinical Seminary in Breslau, which was incorporated after the war to Poland. Then the third agent concerned with our libraries was the so-called Fund for National Renewal, whose approach to the looted books can be summarized as purely economic. It sought to sell them per kilo, really, for the benefit of the state, and indeed did so in 1947, with several millions of the confiscated German books sold at auctions to both private dealers and trading companies that subsequently distributed them around the world. Among the many buyers was, for instance, Theo Pinkus, an interesting person, a German Jewish refugee in Switzerland who founded a rare book search service in Zurich in 1940. And then Pinkus described his purchases in Czechoslovakia as follows, and you can see him here. The Czechs had huge amounts of books stacked in castles, gyms, and warehouses. There were 2 main types of books: those stolen and confiscated by the Nazis from Jews and politically persecuted persons, but then also huge amounts of Nazi literature that belonged to the Sudeten Germans. We were allowed to search these warehouses. To me, it was amazing. I found some first-class literature there. The first time we visited, we filled a railroad car. When such a freight arrived in Zurich, we were able to offer hundreds of books that were on our search lists. This economy was absolutely unique. And then the last body that dealt with the looted libraries was the National Cultural Commission, operating under the Ministry of Education, whose main task was to preserve cultural property in Czechoslovakia, and thus the Commission, in this vein, just sought to use the confiscated assets mainly for the restoration of cultural and educational institutions in the state, and indeed transfer parts of the confiscated books to local museums throughout the country. So in practice, none of these bodies managed to achieve all of their goals, but each, and this is important for us, took a certain share of the confiscated books in the Sudetenland. And today it is no longer possible to determine which and how many Jewish books left the castles through this channel until at the end of 1947, the Jewish Museum in Prague managed to transfer them to its premises. But in any case, following this anti-German legislation, the looted libraries of German Jews were pushed into a kind of limbo. On the one hand, the Jewish Museum in Prague struggled to claim them, but on the other, the state agents just treated them and distributed them as Nazi property. And the libraries were somehow rescued from this limbo by the intervention of several Jewish institutions that took interest in the fate of the looted Jewish assets, cultural assets, at the end of the war. And here, due to really time constraints, I will mention them only very briefly, but to conclude, I want to focus on one specific initiative that I think concerns us the most, but also that exerted the greatest impact on the German Jewish libraries. So as you can see, between 1945 and 1948, the German Jewish libraries in Prague were claimed, for instance, but not so obvious institutions like the Royal Library in Copenhagen, which sought to establish a kind of memorial library for the European Jewry there, but also by the World Jewish Congress, which attempted to receive just all the property from the Theresienstadt ghetto camp. Then a significant portion of the books, and by significant I mean around 100,000 books, were purchased by joint for the Jewish prisoners in the DP camps in Germany. Then some were claimed by the members of the Central Association of German Citizens of Jewish Faith, those who, of course, managed to escape from Germany, so the claim came from England, actually. Finally, a great portion of books was purchased by Shmuel Warman, a well-known German Jewish bookseller who brought them to Jerusalem. However, the most significant initiative was that of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Then the university called for the rescue of Jewish libraries in Germany very early, indeed after the November pogrom of 1938, but concrete action for their sake, let's say, materialized only in March 1944 with the establishment of a special body at the university called the Committee for the Salvaging of Diaspora Treasures, Hava'ada le'atzalat Otzrot HaGola. And then when the members of this committee learned about the looted libraries in Prague, they sent Gershom Scholem, already then a respected scholar with worldwide reputation, to Czechoslovakia. You may see him in Prague in June 1946 to begin negotiations with local Jewish community, but primarily with Czechoslovak authorities. Then his mission was continued by Hugo Bergman, also very known, his older brother, not so known, Arthur Bergman, and Zev Shek. You can see him in the central, later known primarily as a diplomat, who came to Prague, who kept coming to Prague over the next 2 years with a common goal. And this goal was put that way in an official letter that Scholem submitted to the Prague community, and I quote, "We are convinced that these cultural goods should be collected in the places with a vibrant Jewish life, where there is a possibility that these goods, meaning the books, can be actually used and be available both for research purposes and for the development of religious and cultural needs of the Jewish community. These books, which had been transported to this state's territory by the Nazis and ended up here by chance, can in no way even begin to fulfill their proper purpose, as they will in Palestine. Notwithstanding the fact that a large part of the German Jews have settled in Palestine, and the great intellectual tradition of German Jewry will find its continuation at the end of quote." So, following lengthy negotiations with the Czechoslovak authorities, the university was quite successful and indeed managed to obtain permission to transfer some 40,000 duplicates from the holdings entrusted previously to the Jewish Museum in Prague. However, just before they began to prepare the shipment, the Communist Revolution of February 1948 put the whole operation on hold, as just most of the government officials involved in it, they had been dismissed by the communists at that time. In spite of this significant drawback, Zev Shek, this guy, managed to receive the approval, and then he decided even to take a greater risk and replaced some of the duplicates with manuscripts and rare books from German Jewish collections, for the transfer of which the university did not have permission. This gamble paid off quite well, and the shipments then left Prague, the first in April and the second in September 1948. Then, of course, due to the war escalating in Israel, at the same time, the libraries had to wait in Europe, so they were in Antwerp for another 2 years and arrived in Jerusalem only in January 1950, and one may say that it was really the very last moment. A few months later, the Jewish Museum in Prague was officially nationalized by the communist regime. And then somehow to conclude it, what happened to the books once they arrived in Jerusalem. So once they were here, the university decided to keep the details of the transfer confidential. The crates were not inventoried, and the books were not catalogued, unfortunately, in a way that could reveal their provenance. Thus, it is nearly impossible to track them in the National Library's collections today. This was then, one may say, a final act of dissolving the German Jewish libraries, in the name, paradoxically, of post-war cultural reconstruction. Although many of their books survived physically, the libraries as distinct entities, each with the unique history, each with its unique meaning, did not find a real home, but disappeared within different collections, at different institutions, and on different continents. Thank you very much for your attention.